Welcome back to another video of gaming on Intel Arc GPU, and today we're going to jump on Baldur's Gate 3. Welcome to Respawn PC, I'm Dunk, let's game on. First off, the quick disclaimer, I'm playing on a freshly installed Windows without any junkware. The platform I'm using is the i3-12100F, 16GB of memory, and whatever GPU Arc that I'm going to test. Obviously with resizable bar enabled. We're going to start with the lowest of the lowest, the Arc A310 at 1080p and low settings. We're trying to reach a 30 FPS to be deemed playable. I'm currently playing in the haunted house in the Baldur's Gate lower city, because apparently it seems to be harder on the GPU than walking around in the city. So that little A310 gives us a 42 FPS on low settings 1080p. It's pegged at 99% and we're using 4.3 GB of memory, VRAM for the GPU. There's a there's a 300 megabyte that is shared on the RAM. So out of our 16 GB, we're using 11.8. So we still have some headroom. And I think that's the reason that when you start the game for the first time, you're going to encounter some starter. Take about 10 to 15 minutes before the starter just smooth away. When everything is finally load out or load in, the game finally run really smoothly. Since our goal is to find out the 30 FPS, decide to try out medium settings at 1080p. And this gave us a 36 FPS, still highly playable. GPU still pegged at 99 to 100%. Now using 4.7 GB of VRAM, we have almost 800 megabyte of share memory with the system, but we're still averaging 13 GB of memory for the system out of 16. Then trying to push the limit of the A310, 1080p, high settings. This was not playable. We have an average of 25 FPS. It started a lot. We're using 5 GB of VRAM out of 4, so we are using 14.4 GB of memory of the system itself. It's not playable. Keep in mind, I don't have any FSR enabled. There's no upscaling, so maybe it's playable, but I'm just in negative right now. Now continuing from the A310, we jump to the A380 and keeping the same setting of the last gameplay, so 1080p high settings, we get an average of 35 FPS, meaning that now it's highly playable at high settings. So if you're a 1080p player, this card is a super budget one for your rig if you want to play this game. And the upgrade from 4 GB VRAM to 6 GB of VRAM, I'm for sure helped a lot in that, because we're using 5.7 GB of VRAM of the available 6, meaning we don't use anymore the system memory, which went down from 14.4 to 12.5 GB of memory. And since we're above 30 FPS, let's try ultra setting. And by doing so, we drop from 36 FPS to 32 FPS, meaning it's still highly playable and there's no higher settings. And you can also still enable FSR 2.0. But now again, we're using more VRAM than what is available at 6.1 GB of VRAM. So we start to hinder in the system memory instead. We reach a 13.4 GB of system memory. It's something you need to keep in mind if you get the Intel Arc GPU. If you're using more higher settings, it may start to eat up your system memory. And if you're already limited in system memory, like you have 8 GB because you're ultra budget, you may not have enough of a system memory. Anyway, 33 FPS at 1080p ultra settings is a good result. I won't try 1440p with this card, because who's going to spend so few on a card but so much on a monitor? Jumping to the next level is the Intel Arc A580. This is now a 8 GB card instead of 6 or 4, and we continue where we left the A380, meaning 1080p ultra settings. And doing so, we are averaging 73 FPS. This is highly playable with a nice visual, and if you enable FSR, I'm very sure you're going to be out of the chart for the FPS, if this is what you're looking for. Probably can play the game at the high settings at the 1440p, but it's not really a card for 1440p, because if you can only play one game at that resolution, unless it's that the only game you want to play, and you want to play at that resolution, okay, sure, I guess. Because the GPU is not even pegged, it's at 70 to 80% of utilization out of the 8 GB of VRAM. We're using 6.4 to 7, but the system memory, we're almost at 15 GB of memory. When you finally pass the starter time, the time it used to load everything so the game becomes smooth, this card is really perfect for really budget build. And jumping from the 580 is the A750 Elden Ring Edition, my version, and from 1080p ultra settings to 1440p high settings. We got an average of 56 FPS, but the high was in the 88 and the low was in 43. It was really not smooth gameplay. It was still highly playable, but not the best smoothness. Yes, the GPU was pegged at 99% utilization. We're using 7.3 GB of VRAM out of 8, and every time you start a conversation with the NPC, the FPS drop drastically in the mid-40s. Like every time it need to load the NPC detail and texture, the GPU get a hit, like a surprise FPS drop. And still with the A750 Elden Ring Edition, crank up the settings to Ultra. Didn't make much a difference. Instead of 56 FPS, we're now 54 FPS. Still highly playable, but the FPS high and low still out of the chart again. But it was less worse than when I was trying at the high settings. So maybe I didn't left enough time for all the assets and texture to whatever load in the VRAM or the RAM or wherever it load, because it was way more smoother, reaching the high in the 70s, but in the lows in the mid-50s. But still get the same issue when you talk to an NPC, the FPS drop like hell. And the last GPU on the list, the Intel Arc A770 LE edition, playing at 1440p at ultra settings, no FSR. And surprisingly enough, I get a little bit lower FPS than the 750 ER, but the gameplay was smooth. We had 50 FPS, no super high, no super low, it was stable and smooth. And we were using, out of the 16 GB of VRAM, 16.5, and out of this system, which is the i7-14700K and 32 GB of memory, we're using 23 to 24 GB of memory. So even though the A750 AR have 100 MHz base clock for the GPU, my A770 LE is doing quite well because of its 16 GB of VRAM. Maybe I should try to get the A770 OC to see maybe there's an even bigger difference with the OC variant. So there you have it, Intel Arc GPU with Baldur's Gate 3. Thanks for watching and see you in the next one. And subscribe.